being recorded. It's all yours.
Thank you. We are getting close to the end of the book of Leviticus, and there are really 3 chapters left, 25, 26, and 27. And as we will look in tonight's lesson, these 3 chapters are a transitional part of the book of Leviticus. It concludes God's giving of the Levitical law to Moses on Mount Sinai, and it prepares for the transition for the people to depart Mount Sinai and go through the wilderness toward the promised land. In time perspective, we know that from history, this generation that departs from Mount Sinai, except for a few people, they don't get to the promised land. But when they depart from Mount Sinai, they are departing to go to the promised land. And God is going to fulfill the promise of giving them the land he promised as part of the covenant. I call this section, we're focused on chapter 25, as the Sabbath cycles, because we're going to really talk about what many scholars refer to as the Sabbath principle, or the principle of sevens. On the 7th day of the week, you celebrate the Sabbath as a day of rest and a day set apart to establish and maintain your covenant relationship with the Lord. The focus tonight will be the Sabbath year. After 6 years, the 7th year is the Sabbath year, which is a period of time where the land is given a rest and the people are excused from their agricultural or farming activities, and they have to trust and depend upon the Lord to provide for them in that whole year where they don't plant or harvest crops, and they let the land rest. And in letting the land rest, if you have an agricultural society, the people rest. They can do other tasks and other work, but if their main work is farming, there's only so many times you can polish your boots and get ready for the next year of farming. Then we're going to get to the 3rd cycle of the Sabbath, and that's called the year of Jubilee. And that is celebrated after 7 Sabbath years. So that's 490 years pass. Then you come up to the 50th year, which is the year of Jubilee. And those that have been fortunate enough to remain married for 50 years, that's the Jubilee anniversary. It's the 50th year of being married. So we're going to talk about the cycles of Sabbaths, or the Sabbath cycles. Now, not last week, but the last lesson, we looked at chapter 24. And as a review of that chapter, we started out with the proposition that chapter appeared to be out of place, because chapter 24 is interspersed in between the previous chapter 23 that talked about the redemptive feasts, and the chapter we're going to study tonight, chapter 25, which talks about the Sabbath cycles. And yet here in the middle of it is it goes off into 3 different subjects. And we talked that chapter 24 reminded the Israelites the importance of maintaining the sanctity or the holiness of their covenant relationship to the Lord. And it was broken down into 3 what appears to be unrelated topics: maintaining the sanctity of the covenant relationship with God, maintaining the sanctity of God's holy name, and maintaining the sanctity of life. So it emphasizes to us, before we get into the sabbatical or Sabbath years, we get into emphasize that the relationship between God and man was designed to be a holy relationship, requiring mankind to maintain the sanctity of the relationship on a daily basis. How do we do that today? Prayer, Bible study, fellowship, worship, and also to recognize the holiness of God's name. We live in a society where God's name is misused so many times, but for us, in our relationship with a holy and righteous God, his name represents who God is. And finally, to incorporate and exercise sanctity in our judicial system, in our laws, not to take advantage of people, and to respect the sanctity of life. God gave human beings life, and we are to protect life. And when a person takes another human being's life, murder, then God said that it's an eye for an eye. It's just punishment. It's equal punishment to the crime. And so the death penalty was imposed because God recognized the sanctity of life. So this is chapter 24 is a constant reminder of continually maintaining the relationship of holiness between man and God. Now we get into the redemptive chapter dealing with the Sabbaths, and that's chapter 25. And in chapter 5, we like to refer to as the cycle of Sabbaths, but it's really a chapter of rest and liberty. The Sabbath always represented rest to the people, and God recognized that we can't live our lives burning our candles at both ends, working 24/7. Human beings need their rest. In fact, when people suffer from sleep and rest deprivation, they don't function as well. They don't think as well. It could even lead to mental illness. And so rest is a very important part of God's plan of taking care of human beings in their fallen nature, in their nature of flesh, where they need to be recuperating and resting and restoring. It's also a chapter of liberty. And when we talk about liberty, we're talking about freedom. One of the things that imprisons more people on this planet is poverty. When people are in poverty, they go into slavery. We talk about all of the trafficking for prostitution that goes on in the world. One of the biggest problems that happened when economies fall apart is that in order to survive, women go into prostitution. People become bond servants to other people. Poverty is probably the worst result of sin, and it creates all sorts of problems. And God recognized this, and so built into this cycle of Sabbaths is the being liberated from debt, being given a fresh start or a clean slate, if you'd like to call it that way. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson that we get from chapter 25 is God's redemptive laws in the Jubilee year allowed his people to start over with a clean slate by canceling their indebtedness and restoring their land, all foreshadowing the eternal Sabbath year of Jubilee when God will restore the land and eternal life to his people, just as God intended when he created the world. So it really foreshadows the ultimate Sabbath that we will celebrate when God restores humanity and man is living in a world without sin under God's provision and God being the king. Now, the outline of what we're going to call, or of the topics, is we're going to have a general introduction and background to the Sabbath cycles and the Sabbath principles. Then we're going to talk about the laws of redemption during the Jubilee year. And then the short little part on the ultimate redemption of God's people. And then we'll conclude like we did before in previous classes with discussion questions that Paul really likes, and then conclusions and applications. Well, let's talk about the background to the Sabbath cycles and the Sabbath principles. As I mentioned before, chapters 25 through 27, the last 3 chapters of the book of Leviticus, are transitional chapters. They're really presented in a chiastic or chiasm arrangement. And in the page 4, it starts with chapter 25, which is laws regarding redemption. And then in the middle, blessings for covenant obedience and curses for covenant disobedience. That's what we'll focus on next week. And then chapter 27, it goes back to laws about redemption. So the last 3 chapters are kind of like a part of Leviticus that stands by itself in this structure. Redemption is a major theme in chapters 25 and 27. The Hebrew word or verb for redeem occurs 10 times in chapters 25 and 12 times in chapters 27. Now, between chapters 25 and 27, chapter 26 reminds God's people of the covenant relationship which God established with the nation of Israel. The covenant relationships that we've talked about from the very beginning with the Abram covenant is cumulative, and the covenant of Israel is a conditional covenant, and it was given to the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai, and it really highlights the blessings that God promises to give for his people's obedience to his laws, and the curses which would result if they failed to be obedient to his laws. It's a conditional covenant. Now, again, this last three chapters are part of the covenants or the laws that God gave to his people at Mount Sinai. It completes the covenant law that God gave to Moses. And it establishes the whole basis of the relationship, the covenant relationship between God and Israel as God's people. But these three chapters also make the transition to the next book that we're going to study, and that's the book of Numbers. Because these three chapters all deal with, you're going to leave Mount Sinai, you're going to journey through the wilderness, and you're going to the promised land. And so these are really chapters that set the stage for literally Israel to pick up its stakes and start journeying towards the promised land. And this is the fulfillment of the covenant promise that God made. It started with the promise he made to Abraham. Remember Abraham going up on the mountain, and God, after Lot departed from him and took the more favorable area for the flocks of sheep, and God showed to Abraham, he said, look in all directions, and this is the land I promised to give you and your descendants. And so this is a fulfillment of God's covenant promise to Abraham. Now, it also, chapters 25 and 27, as I mentioned before, focus on the Sabbath being the sign of the covenant. Anytime there's a covenant, there's a sign. The Sabbath represents the sign of the covenant. And so when I say a sign of the covenant, it's something that reflects that relationship. If the Israelites celebrated the Sabbath, they had to trust God. It would be like you have so much work to do and you can't get it done, but you don't work on Sunday. You're trusting God, he's going to give you time management that you're going to be able to do the work and the volume of work that's imposed upon you. In an agricultural society, think of it, taking a full year off from farming, the kind of trust that you'd have to place on the Lord, the faith that you would put in the Lord providing for you. So this covenant relationship requires the celebration or the following of the laws dealing with the Sabbath. You don't work. You dedicate the day to your relationship with God. And every year, every 6 years, on the seventh year, you do the same thing. You refrain from farming, and then you trust God that he's going to provide for you. Now, we already have evidence that God provided for the Israelites. How do you support 1 million plus people in a desert without water, without bread, without food? And we already studied in Exodus how God provided for his people. He provided water miraculously. He provided manna, which everybody today scratches their head and says, what exactly was that? Well, it's bread from heaven. And when you talk about meat, the quail, all of a sudden the quail would show up so much that the ground was covered with quail. You know, I like quail, I like chicken, but you know, every night and every day, even with God providing for them, they complained about it. Now, we're going to talk about the principles of God's covenant relationship with Israel. And I call these the Sabbath principles, because the understanding of this chapter, chapter 25, rests on understanding things that are important to God in dealing with the man he created. The first thing is the importance of the family. God created the family structure. And this is why the Israelites always kept a record of their ancestors and the family structure. The purpose of the family structure was primarily so that the patriarch of the family, the clan leader, would not only in the early times judge his clan members, but the most important thing was to pass on the teachings and principles about the Lord. So the family was structured so that the next generation, the children and the descendants, would honor their parents by honoring the Lord's instructions to the parents' faithfulness to the Lord. And so when the family structure was strong, just like today, if you're a strong church family, you go to church. And if you're a strong Christian family, you read the Bible together, you pray together, you worship God together. These are things that build the relationship between man and God, and it's a family that's central to this. Doesn't take too much to see what's going on with our country as the family structure goes and falls apart and is criminalized with homosexual marriages and everything else. God is left out of the equation completely. So the second thing that's a principle that goes throughout these chapters is the importance of land. Now, ownership of land in an agricultural society is important because land is what is used to create wealth. You grow crops on land, you live on land, you tend your herds and your cattle on land. But one principle, besides the fact that land represented wealth or ability to survive with God's blessing, because it's God that blesses the harvest. If God withholds the rain, you don't have crops. If God withholds any number of things that from the land, pestilence or anything else, you lose your herds. But the main principle is God owns his creation. Period. He owns the land. We are, even though we have an ownership interest in the land, we're just stewards. We're just tenants on God's property. And this is a principle that permeates the sabbatical years that we're going to talk about. So God is basically saying, in your family structure and in the way that I will give you the land to have stewardship over, we're going to carry out this covenant relationship, because if you obey the Sabbaths and you obey the laws of the Sabbath and you obey the laws that I've given you on Mount Sinai, I'll bless you. I'll bless you with crops. I'll bless you with water. I'll bless you with herds of sheep, and you will prosper. You disobey me, and there'll be curses, and the curses will affect you in terms of famine, war, and all the other things that come. And those that went through the study of Kings, the book of Kings, and the apostasy of the northern kingdom, which led to the Assyrians taking away the Israelites from the northern kingdom, and then later the apostasy of the southern kingdom, Judah and Babylon coming, and the exile. How many times did we see famine? How many times did we see withholding of rain? How many times did we see God saying, your apostasy is causing the curses to happen to you? So with those themes about the importance of family, the importance of land, and the importance of following the covenant laws, we're going to get into the Sabbath cycles. Leviticus chapters 25 verses 1 through 7, the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelites and say to them, whenever you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather your crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your manservant, your maidservant, and the hired worker and the temporary resident who lives among you, as well as for your livestock and wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. So what the Lord is basically saying, you are not in that 7th year, when the land is given a rest, you're not going to work the land. You can if anybody that's been in a farm knows that if you let a field, I think they call it fallow for a year, where you don't plant or harvest,
Right.
you go out there and in the year of the land's resting, you're going to have some crops show up anyway, just from what the seeds and everything that were left over from the previous year. Whatever the land produces naturally, they could eat. And but really what they depended on in faith to the Lord is what the Lord would provide in the year before the Sabbath year. He would produce such bounty. It's kind of like what happened in Egypt, years of bounty to take care of years of a lack or not having the harvest. And so their faith was in the Lord and what he would provide in the 6th year if they were to practice the laws of the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, the Israelites were required to observe what we call a Sabbath year. And that was a time of rest for the land and for the people. Notice how God is taking care of the people and his creation. Now, they could perform during the Sabbath year, unlike the Sabbath day, they could perform non-agricultural work, and they can pick and eat whatever the land grew naturally. But they were precluded from doing anything that was related to working the land. And that was an important part of the Sabbath year. Now, the Sabbath year followed the requirement of setting aside and resting on the Sabbath day by setting it so you had the same principle of Sabbath rest of the Sabbath day, but this time carried for the Sabbath year. And during the Sabbath year of rest, it was supposed to also remind them that God created the earth and that they were stewards to the earth, and that this was a period where the land was to be restored and regenerated by not being worked, and where the people were restored and regenerated. Now, this Sabbath year applied to aliens who lived with the Israelites, and they were also applied to non-Israelites that were hired foreigners. They had migrant farmers come in or to harvest crops and things. These migrant workers from Gentile nations, they were required to follow the Sabbath year. So it was like put the whole agricultural society on pause for a year, and it included because this is the promised land which God gave to the Israelites. It applied to anybody living in the land. Now, and as I mentioned before, this was a test of faith. Now we're going to go from Sabbath day to Sabbath year to the year of Jubilee. And this comes from the scriptures where the verses 8 through 13 of chapter 25 of Leviticus. The words of the scripture say, count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpets sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, if you remember when we studied that, that was the 10th day of the 7th month. Sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property. Note, the Lord is saying that these families return to the property. God puts importance over people, over land and property. So, and each to his own clan. There's that family structure, that principle of family. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the untended vines, for it is a jubilee and it is to be holy. So it's not just rest, it's a period of time where they also trust and have faith in the Lord and fulfill their covenant relationship with the Lord. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of Jubilee, everybody is to return to their own property. Now, the word Jubilee is derived, there's some secular discussion that it was derived from a Latin word, but most scholars say that it really was derived from the Hebrew word Yobel, which comes from Karen Aha Yobel, which translates the horn of a ram. The horns of rams were used to make trumpets, and the word Yobel became a synonym for trumpet. The year of Jubilee was announced by loud trumpets, which every 50th year proclaimed the commencement of the Jubilee year on the 10th day of the 7th month. Again, that was the Day of Atonement. The number 7 has significance in Scripture, particularly in the book of Leviticus. It's associated with the Sabbath, as we can see in this chapter. It also represents completeness, the end of a cycle, the end of a period. The establishment of the Jubilee year on the 50th year following 7 periods or cycles of 7 years made the Jubilee year the Sabbath year of Sabbath years, or what I like to call, this is Bob Fryism, you're not considering too much later, a super Sabbath. So it's a super Sabbath year. Historically, there's been a debate as to exactly when did this year take place. Some scholars, and there's quite a few, we're talking about a large minority of scholars, 40 some percent if you want to count it. Some scholars believe that the 50th year overlapped the 7th Sabbath year in the 7th cycle, so that both the Jubilee and the Sabbath year, the 7th Sabbath year, were on the same year, the same time. The majority of scholars, however, believe that the last of the 7 Sabbath years and the Jubilee years were 2 separate years. Well, look at the impact that would have on agriculture. Not only do you have no agriculture in the 7th year Sabbath, but the following year, which is the Jubilee, you'd have no agriculture activity going on. So you have 2 full years where the land is given a period of rest and the people are not permitted to work the land. This interpretation is consistent in the language of verses 18 through 22 of chapter 25, if you read that language as applying to the Jubilee. It's certainly in context in this part of the Leviticus chapter 25 that talks about the Jubilee. And it says in 18 through 22, follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, what will we eat in the 7th year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year. Okay, if you get a lawyer to analyze this, there's inconsistencies in this paragraph. The first thing that leads to the inconsistency is it talks, what will we eat in the 7th year? Doesn't say year Jubilee. But in the rest of it, it says, I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will bless you for a total of 3 years. So you have some ambiguity there. And unfortunately, in the history of Israel, we're not sure whether they ever followed this year of Jubilee. There's some indications that they did, but in the book of Josephus, the year of Jubilee is never mentioned. Right. So that's kind of curious as to whether they did celebrate the year of Jubilee. Now, as I mentioned before, the year of Jubilee began on the Day of Atonement, which was not only a day of Sabbath rest by itself, but also it took place in the 7th month. And it was a day when both the people and the tabernacle were cleansed. The Day of Atonement was a day of cleansing for the nation and for the tabernacle. It really was an appropriate day to start a Jubilee year set apart for the Lord after 49 years of Sabbaths. The year of Jubilee was a year which liberated the people from their debts and restored their land. At the start of the Jubilee year, the people were released or they were forgiven from their debts, which resulted or caused them to sell their property or to sell themselves into bondage. When people in an agricultural society can't pay their debts and the land, they start parceling out or selling pieces of their land, they're slowly using up the only asset that they have to produce income. And so what they slowly are doing is getting themselves to be more and more poverty stricken. And so what was happening, and God recognized this principle, there's a lot of reasons why people would not be able to make a living off of farming. We see it all the time. It could be weather, it could be um, poor management of land, it could be bad seed. There's 100 ways to fail as a farmer and only a couple of ways to succeed. Anybody that's tried farming will know that it's really a crapshoot as to whether or not you're going to have a harvest that's going to produce income.
Right.
So when you have an agricultural society that depends on land and production, you have people that get into poverty all the time. In the Jubilee year, the Israelites who sold their property or ultimately sold themselves into bondage so that they could survive would be given a fresh start, a clean slate. How would you like to have the law firm of Fry, and Fry again give you a free bankruptcy that clears all your debts and gives you back your property? You have to live 50 years. You'd prefer, like most of us would like to be able to work out and rebuy our property or redeem it. But in God's plan, the year of Jubilee was a fresh start. And so debts were forgiven and land was restored. And so the ownership of the land, it went back to the family, the clan. And if you study the book of Joshua, when the Israelites conquered the promised land, what they did is they allocated different parts of the promised land to different tribes. And then the tribes suballocated the land to clans, and the clans suballocated to families. And so families were identified with the land, and they're identified with a specific piece of land. So what we had is the people were returning to their ancestral land, the land that they acquired after the conquest of the promised land. This is a year of Jubilee when liberty was proclaimed to all the inhabitants of the promised land. Interesting, inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, which was cast in 1752, that's before the American Revolution, are the words taken from the King James translation of Leviticus chapter 25:10. And on the Liberty Bell, you can read, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." And so anybody that says that the people that founded our country was not influenced by the Bible and by the Judaic Christian heritage, look at the Liberty Bell. And when the Declaration of Independence was finally signed by the Continental Congress, then the Liberty Bell was rung to proclaim their liberty from England. Later on, the Liberty Bell was cracked, and it's never been, it wasn't, they tried to repair it with a plug, and it's never been able to be rung again. So anyway, it's just interesting that our country picks up this phrase from the book of Leviticus. Now let's talk about the laws of redemption during the Jubilee year. The laws of property redemption it applies to those Israelites who are forced to sell their property because of poverty. There are three situations of indebtedness that are covered in chapter 25. It's the situation when they get into a little trouble and they need to go and get, payday loan or something, but they have to borrow a little bit of money to buy seed to keep going. And they intend to pay it back because they intend to plant crops. Well, the situation can become worse where they had to sell some or all of their land in order to pay their debts and survive. And after they sell their land and they're still in debt, then they ended up selling themselves into bondage. They would become a servant to either an Israelite, a fellow Israelite, or they become a servant to a foreigner living in the land of Israel. Now, the laws of redemption which took place in the Jubilee year were based upon the twofold premise that God, as the creator of all things, considered himself as the owner of the land and owner of all creation. And that the second principle, that God's love for his people prohibited them from being permanently dispossessed or removed from ownership of the land God promised them. God just, he really has a love for his people. He demanded the Israelites not abuse or mistreat the poor, and he himself provided in his laws a redemption so that people would not exist in generation after generation of poverty. Although the Israelites always had the right to redeem their land at any time if they earned the money, and they could earn their money from various ways. They could do so by farming what is left of their land. They could do it by a relative redeeming a property for them. They could do it by other work that they perform, or they can redeem their land by being a servant to somebody else. The ultimate redemption was God the Redeemer. In the year of Jubilee, their debts were forgiven. Now, in this principle, the land was sold or alienated, encumbered, by the principle that its value represented the number of years or the number of crop seasons left before the Jubilee year started. So what you do is, if you've got the very first year of the 49 years and you're just wiped out, impoverished, and you sell your land, well, your land is going to have the most value in that first year because you have almost 48 or 49 years of crops that can be harvested by whoever buys your land. So the land is worth a lot. But let's say you're in the 49th year and you have to sell your land. Well, the buyer of the land only gets 1 year of crops before the year of Jubilee and the debt's forgiven. There's not much value left in the property. So this principle is used to value the land when it's sold. So the more years remaining until the year of Jubilee, the greater the value with respect to the sale of the land. The Israelite who sold all or a part of his ancestral land, we talked about the options that they had to buy it back. But the principle in the year of Jubilee is that God is the Redeemer. It's God's laws that forgive the debts, and the Israelites in their covenant relationship with God are required to forgive the debts. So the redemption of property also included the redemption of the houses that were built on the agricultural land. These are not the houses that are built inside the cities or the walled cities, but you go out in the countryside in Pennsylvania, you'll see the farmhouse, the silo, those building structures out there in the land. And when you redeemed the land, or when you, in the year of Jubilee, you got your possession and ownership of the land back, well, then it came with the houses and the silos and what's in the silos and all that stuff. So you get a really true fresh start. Now, in walled cities, the houses were not subject to the year of forgiveness or debt forgiveness. There's if you were lived in a walled city, that's not, you don't make a living off of agriculture, and the house isn't tied to the agricultural society. So if you sold your house, you had a 1 year period of time to redeem it. After that, whoever bought your house in the city, in the walled city, they got to keep it forever. So we have that principle now because when we have a sheriff's sale of property, there's a year, or a tax sale of property, the person that loses his property to a sheriff or tax sale has 1 year to redeem it. After that, whoever buys it. So you get a certificate from the sheriff's office or from the assessor's office, and you don't get title to the property until a year from that certificate of sale to get full ownership of the property. So the only exception to that is the Levite clan. The Levites were people that helped the priests in the tabernacle, the tribal Levites. They did not get an allocation of land when Israel conquered the promised land. They were allocated to live in one of 28 cities. In those cities, they lived in houses. For the Levites, their period of redemption was forever. So there wasn't a 1 year redemption period if they ever were required to sell their houses, they could redeem it at any time. When it comes to property, the laws of the Jubilee precluded the Israelites from oppressing or taking advantage of their fellow Israelites who became poor and could not repay their debts. The principle of an Israelite could not charge another Israelite interest, and he had to enable the Israelite to still sustain himself. So if I own a piece of property, I'm impoverished, I can't live, I sell my land to another Israelite, and I want to repay him, the Israelite cannot charge interest on my loan. And if he makes me a tenant farmer on his property before the Jubilee redemption of the property, then he has to give me the ability to sustain myself as well as earn money to pay the debt back. So he becomes a tenant farmer to the land he once owned until he or his descendants reach the year of Jubilee and it's redeemed. Now, what about the Israelites that sell themselves into servitude? The Israelites who became so impoverished or poor that they had to sell themselves to become a servant of another Israelite or a foreigner living in the promised land, they really became, the word is slaves, but in this context, they really are servants. And it's under an agreement where they are in servitude for a period of time with this fixed wage. If the Israelite who sold themselves into servitude was not able to earn enough money to buy back their freedom, then he was automatically freed, liberated on the year of Jubilee. His debts forgiven. He was no longer bonded in servitude to the other person. And this applied to whether he was a servant of a Israelite or a foreigner. So if I indebted myself as a servant to a foreigner on the year of Jubilee, the foreigner living in the promised land had to release me. It was the law. And I did not owe any money to him for releasing me. So this applied to Israelites that were sold. But if I were a foreigner and I was impoverished and I sold myself into servitude, didn't apply to them. It only applied to Israelites. So God protected his people. Now, the foreigner or the Gentile that was taken from a nation outside the promised land, they became what the scriptures call slaves, identified as permanent servants. They're permanent servants for life. And as such, they were in servitude and they did not get released from their servitude by the year of Jubilee or by any means except for certain rules that applied to them. One rule is the rule that if they were mistreated or abused by their master, then Jewish law provided for the slave or the servitude to be terminated. When we talk about the word slavery, the first thing that comes to our mind is, because of the controversy in our society, about the abuses of slavery in our own history. But you go back in history and look at the abuse of slavery in the Roman Empire and some of the other abuses of slavery. And in the context of Leviticus, a lot of people criticize our faith, our God, based upon this part of Leviticus talking about slavery. But it isn't the same type of slavery. The slaves or the servants, the permanent servants, had rights. If they were abused, they had to be released from slavery. The Israelites were commanded to treat their slaves or their servants with compassion. And although there are incidents in Israel's history where they mistreated their servants, their permanent servants, the laws provided recourse to these servants. They had the right to rest on the Sabbath, and also they had the right to participate in all the Israelite festivals. The other thing that's interesting is that even though the language of chapter 35 talks in terms of these permanent servants being property, it's not property in the sense of chattel, of an inhuman, inanimate property object. It really was In the same way that we talk about players for professional sports teams, a certain player is property that can be traded. We have professional teams all over trading one player for another player, and they're being traded like, we could say traded like chattel, but they have chattel with value. They're human beings with skills. And so this is the same concept that Israel had with their permanent servants. In many cases, and there's a lot of examples in the Old Testament where permanent servants were treated as household members. And like I said before, they were able to partake in some of the Jewish festivals and ceremonies. So those are basically the rules. I didn't think it was necessary to go into the specific wording of the rest of chapter 25, but that's pretty much the concept behind the year of Jubilee and the law of the Sabbaths. The ultimate redemption of God's people, or the ultimate Sabbath millennium, if you will, is God, as the creator of all things, is the owner of everything in his creation, including the land, crops, resources, which God in his providence provides to his people. God redeemed the Israelites from their bondage in Egypt and entered into a covenant relationship with the Israelites, promising to lead them into the promised land. God's redemption of the Israelites and the blessings which God promised were conditioned on the Israelites' obedience to the laws which God gave to them at Mount Sinai. The laws of Jubilee embodied a promise that God's people were never intended to be kept in bondage or slavery forever. God's redemptive plan enabled his people to be redeemed to their land and restored their liberty in the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year really foreshadows the redemption of God's people and the permanent restoration of God's people to the inheritance which their ancestors, our ancestors, Adam and Eve, initially received in the Garden of Eden. God is going to restore, there's going to be a Jubilee year, a Jubilee time, a Jubilee period of history where what God intended with his creation with Adam and Eve before the fall is going to be restored to his people on earth, and then later on in the new heaven and earth. The redemption and restoration which took place in the year of Jubilee was provided by God and did not require the Israelites to buy it back. Sound familiar? God provided Jesus, and we can't buy it back. God gives it in his mercy and grace. So the future restoration of mankind is really God's gift, and it's provided by God and can't be purchased. And this, we know, the ultimate Sabbath of Sabbaths is fulfilled through the work of Jesus Christ. So I hope that gives you a perspective on the year of Jubilee. I wonder how much better our society would be if we have bankruptcy laws, which are a derivative of the year of Jubilee, but how we could avoid the problem of the amassing of wealth in a few people and the impoverishing of the masses if we don't have some kind of law that cleans the slate periodically, fresh start for people, so that people aren't in generational poverty like we're experiencing in our country today. Okay, so that concludes the study portion. And we have two questions, Lord, and for his people to be redeemed and liberated from bondage. The laws of the Jubilee year were imposed to give both the land and God's people a rest or a fresh start. Ultimately, the restoration of the land and God's people will be eternal when the Lord will redeem his creation at the end of times. God, in his mercy, used his law to bless Israel and to fulfill his promise in spite of Israel's disobedience. The restoration of God's creation and the redemption of God's people is a reflection of God's love and demonstrates God's ultimate purpose and will towards his creation. So I hope that this gives you a perspective. I really, when I first started to read this chapter and look at it, I didn't appreciate a lot of the things that were brought out tonight. And it was really inspirational to me to pick up some of these points we talked about.
Amen.
Thank you,
Great
Bob.
job.
Amen.